Soul Blazer is the first in a series of games, serving as the precursor to the classic Illusion of Gaia and Terranigma that would set the stage for what has to be one of the most influential trilogies of all time. In terms of the story, Soul Blazer is easily the weakest of the three, but it still manages to relay a surprisingly deep narrative that has seen all life mostly wiped out due to the greed and corruption of a weak-willed but powerful king. You, a supreme being, have been sent down from the sky to get the world back on track, and throughout the journey you'll come across a colourful cast of characters that convey the story and help flesh out the tale in meaningful ways. Now when it comes to gameplay, any of you familiar with the early Zelda games will instantly feel right at home. Most of your time spent playing will consist of mashing the B button to swipe your sword, which is your main form of attack. To complement this, you've also got the ability to cast several spells which can be earned throughout the adventure. There are 8 spells in total, which naturally offer up their own different advantages in battle, but are all beholden to the amount of gems you have, and each costs a certain amount to perform. These gems are usually found on defeated enemies, and saving them for the more challenging boss battles is the best way to guarantee your victory. The RPG elements come into play with the way in which you level up throughout the game. As well as dropping gems, each enemy will also score you some experience points, and upon reaching a certain threshold, you'll level up, increasing your stats and proficiency within the world. It's a solid action RPG, and for those who have not played any of the other entries in the trilogy, I highly suggest you play the other 2 games if you truly enjoy your time with this one. The Super Nintendo was a literal powerhouse when it came to RPGs. With the likes of Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI, there was plenty on offer when it came to choosing a new adventure to jump into. One that never really got its chance in the spotlight though was Bahamut Lagoon. It was one of the last games to be released for the Super Nintendo that managed to pull together many different styles to create one of, if not the best strategy RPG on the system. If there's one shortcoming, however, it's the story that has the pre-standard cycle of gathering allies and destroying an enemy empire bent on world conquest, then discovering and going after a far greater threat. Thankfully, the gameplay is where Bahamut Lagoon shines, and this is no more apparent than when it comes to the battles. As with most SRPGs, you'll be taking command of various units, each with their own distinct uses and advantages as each battle plays out on a grid. You and the enemy take turns to pulverize each other's numbers, but what helps mix things up is the inclusion of dragons. These entities roam the battlefield and are at the core of the combat. Each of them are controlled by the computer, with the player having the option to simply point them in the right direction with limited commands. The careful use of your dragon can often mean the difference between victory or defeat, so deciding to either let them lay waste to everything in their path or stay close and defend your dwindling numbers soon becomes the name of the game. You also get to feed them almost any item you find in the world, which can have a range of different effects on their abilities. This sense of progression really helps Bahamut Lagoon come into its own, and will likely see you coming back to it to see what different builds you can make a second time around. If RPGs are your thing, this is one you won't want to miss. Based on the popular cartoon show, Goof Troop sees Goofy setting out to rescue his friends who have been kidnapped, across 5 separate levels that require you to solve puzzles and take on an ever-increasing amount of enemies. Your main way of defending yourself is barrels, and you can pick them up and throw them at will, allowing you to clear each stage of enemies before tackling the real challenge, which are the puzzles themselves. They often consist of shifting blocks around in order to open the path forward, and immovable objects like rocks or crates are planted in the ground to guide them on their way. Adding to the challenge is the fact that some puzzles have enemies who can kick the blocks around themselves, either breaking them or getting them stuck. Others involve invincible statues that shoot fireballs and only stop when all the blocks have been correctly positioned. This all adds up to make Goof Troop a game, regardless of its childish exterior, one that's not afraid to kick you whilst you're down, and provides a real sense of challenge to anyone who plays it. Now the best aspect of the game is without a doubt the 2-player co-op experience that is easily one of the best you'll find on the Super Nintendo. The ability to collect and toss blocks along with a range of other tactics makes it an extremely rewarding 2-player effort, and even though playing alone is certainly enjoyable, playing with a friend is where the real magic happens. Now the only bad thing I could say about Goof Troop is that it's just over too damn soon. Ultimately, it's a short but fun distraction that's perfect to play with a friend. Space Megaforce is a very unique vertical shooter that was developed by the masters of the genre Compile. It strips away a lot of the fluff that plagued most shooters back in the day, and instead opted for a different approach that put the emphasis back on not having to worry about a seemingly endless list of power-ups, but instead just concentrating on the real threat, namely the enemy. The screen will be absolutely flooded with them at times, and this is where the frantic nature of the gameplay kicks in. Challenging would be an understatement, but thankfully you've got a selection of weapons to help even the odds, ranging from standard lasers to missiles and special abilities that can mop up enemies in a flash. Through the use of distinctive enemy designs and vibrantly drawn level backgrounds, Space Megaforce excels in presentation and atmosphere as well. When enemy ships explode, there is a satisfying explosion, which makes the challenging gameplay even more enjoyable as you develop your skills. On top of this, the developer's ability to overcome slowdown, the most hated opponent of shoot-em-ups on the Super Nintendo, is what stands out as most impressive. The CPU of the Super Nintendo frequently suffered under the strain caused by having several enemies and bullets moving on screen at once, which in turn caused the game to choke. Somehow Toho were able to work around these technical challenges and produce levels with a lot of action and enemies on screen while experiencing very little lag, resulting in what has to be one of the most graphically sound shooters on the console. Space Megaforce may not be the best shoot-em-up of the 16-bit era, but it is definitely one worth playing and should not be overlooked or passed up. Following on from the somewhat generic and downright dreadful Flash Hiders on the NEC Turbo, its sequel Battle Tycoon set out to rectify all of the problems that came along with its predecessor. On the surface it looks much like the same game, but one huge difference is the many new elements Right Stuff added to help it stand out amongst the sea of fighting games on the console. This mainly came in the form of several management and RPG mechanics that all revolved around the betting system. At the beginning of each fight you get to place a bet on yourself, and if you win it's easy to double your money and then spend it on a range of different upgrades for your fighter. Naturally, different fights yield different payouts, so if you beat a low-level opponent you get a little bit of money, but if you defeat a harder enemy that cheats and has you cursing at your screen, you'll be rolling in dough in no time. The more you earn, the easier it becomes to increase your stats and in turn fight the harder opponents and earn more currency. It's a great little system that managed to pull me in, and I found it really hard to put it down once the game had sunk its teeth into me. Of course, as with most fighting games, there's a selection of characters to choose from, each with their own unique attributes and moves, so there's bound to be one that'll take your fancy. Visually though, there's not that much to write home about when it comes to Battle Tycoon. For sure it looks great at a standstill, but during motion it looks a bit cumbersome when compared to other fighting games that released on the Super Nintendo. Of course it's not a deal breaker by any means, as the fantastic gameplay loop more than makes up for any shortcomings that arise with its presentation, so if you're a fan of the genre, Battle Tycoon is well worth trying out for yourself. Now what sets Shadowrun apart from the others in its class of RPGs is the fact that it takes place in a pre-existing universe. Before it was a video game, Shadowrun was a moderately successful cyberpunk tabletop and was set sometime in the not-so-distant future, where the human race experiences an age of awakening that allows mythical creatures to once again walk the earth, a world where technology plays a big part, where expansive corporations rule the globe with an iron fist. Now with the game, you start off in of all places a morgue, with no idea what's happened or how you got there. This isn't your average run-of-the-mill RPG. There's no princesses to save, no religious overtones or some love story bullshit. It instead offers a dark, gritty storyline that sees the streets being ruled by a group of mercenaries known as Shadowrunners. This group perform the dirty work of anyone who can afford their services, and this is where the player comes in. Needless to say, for much of the game you'll be wandering around the city, talking to people and getting into random fights. But there's no battle screen. You just push the A button and out comes your gun, you point the crosshair at whatever you want to kill, and then mash the A button like a madman. Most enemies leave behind a wad of cash after you've taken them out, and you receive karma after doing so as well. Karma serves as your means to level up, but where the RPG mechanics truly come into play. Growing your character and becoming a force to be reckoned with throughout the world is easily the most rewarding part of the game, as there's a noticeable change in not only your abilities, but the way in which NPCs treat you as well. In the end, you have a very original game that is only hindered by its PC-based control system. If you can get past it though, Shadowrun is a game you won't easily forget. If there was one game that could sum up the 90s perfectly, it would have to be Zombies Ate My Neighbors. The tongue-in-cheek humor is non-stop, and part of what makes this game so appealing to many that played it. It sees you filling the shoes of Zeke and Julie, with their mission in the game being to protect their neighbors from armies of zombies, werewolves, aliens, flesh-eating plants, chainsaw-wielding psychos, and pretty much every other 90s cliche you can think of. All of the action takes place from an overhead view, allowing you to see everything at a glance, and the main goal is to rescue as many of your helpless neighbors as possible, all the while killing as many monsters as you can in the process. You've got a ton of ways to achieve this goal as well. The weaponry is pretty creative, and little of it is actually weaponry. From tomatoes to cans of pop, from bazookas to lawnmowers, just about everything in this game can be utilized to kill monsters. Visually, everything is well done. From the character models to the backgrounds, there's a great amount of detail afforded to each. Zombies rise from the ground, forming piles of dirt around their heads as they scramble to the surface, and you can see clumps of dirt falling from their tattered clothes. Though there is no variation between when it comes to the zombies and neighbors' designs, they still all look incredibly well drawn, with several frames of animation and personality to boot. Zombies Ate My Neighbors is a great but challenging game that will likely piss you off at times and even wipe you out with a cheap death or two, but the music and urge for revenge will keep pulling you back in to try and pass that tough level one more time. When it comes down to it, this is one game you do not want to skip. Not many people have heard of this game, and there's a good reason, as it never made its way west and was confined to the Japanese market. It's a sequel to the NES classic Secret Castle, and it's a real shame it never got its chance of success outside of Japan, as the game is absolutely brimming with charm and personality. The player is thrown into the role of Mylon, who's tasked with saving a fairy who's been kidnapped. This sees you traversing a range of different levels that all sport their own unique flavor and threats to overcome, in what is essentially a platformer that's comprised of some pretty unusual mechanics. You've got a jump as well as a basic attack, which sees Mylon being able to shoot bubbles at his enemies to stop them, and then he can walk up to them and push them into the sky. This also doubles as a handy way to create new paths or bridge the gap between two platforms, which can get you out of some pretty tight situations throughout the adventure. Now, the most obvious improvement from the previous game is the presentation. Secret Castle had almost no visual flair to distinguish itself from the crowd of other NES games, yet Doremi Fantasy has looks rivaled by almost none of its contemporaries. A vivid color palette brings to life the various worlds you traverse, from the lush forests and snowy mountains to the delightful candylands and concert halls that make up the game. Even more appealing is the sprite work, which touts some of the most fluid animation you'll see on the system, and the attention to detail is staggering, with Mylon demonstrating a whole range of different reactions to many of the things that take place throughout a level. Overall, if you've exhausted the usual suspects when it comes to platformers on the Super Nintendo, then Doremi Fantasy will more than satisfy your need for something new. The Super Nintendo wasn't exactly known for its wrestling games, and for good reason, as most of them were terrible. This is where Capcom stepped in, and after the huge success of the likes of Street Fighter and Final Fight, they decided to produce Saturday Night Slam Masters, which originally released in the arcades and would go on to become one of the best wrestling games on the Super Nintendo. There's about 10 characters to choose from, with some showing up from Capcom's other properties to all duke it out in the ring. But instead of the constant grappling you see in standard wrestling games, Slam Masters sees you performing spinning kicks, dives, and many other moves that you'd normally find in, you guessed it, a fighting game. This is what helps differentiate Slam Masters from others of its kind on the Super Nintendo, as many of your special attacks are pulled off in much of the same way that Street Fighter special moves are performed. This opens the game to players of all skill levels, and thanks to the easy to pick up and play controls, it's an absolute blast to play through each and every time you do. Now, one of the game's biggest draws, however, are the visuals, which sport some of the best looking sprites you'll find on the console. They're all huge and animate smoothly and stand up against the arcade original surprisingly well. Everything is detailed and crisp, portrayed in bright, vibrant colors that'll grab your attention from the other side of the room. Now, overall, Saturday Night Slam Masters is by no means the greatest wrestling game of all time, and neither is it the best fighting game. Instead, it's a well thought out mix of both that ends up becoming one of the more enjoyable games you can experience on the Super Nintendo. Lufia and the Fortress of Doom is the first game in the series and often gets overlooked by later entries. It's very much a traditional RPG in every sense of the word, and you'll find yourself moving from town to town, equipping your characters with new equipment, moving on to a dungeon to slay the boss, and repeating the cycle over and over. It's a pretty decent story to help break up the action that admittedly does take a while to get going, but once it finds its feet, it's easily one of the finer aspects that make up the game. Of course, no RPG would be complete without a solid combat system, and on this front, Lufia more than holds its own. As with many of its time, Lufia is built around a turn-based system that allows you to perform a wide range of attacks that can be learned and improved over the course of the adventure. Naturally, you'll also have other party members to contend with who each have their own role to play throughout the game, not only in the story, but more importantly in combat as well. Lufia's quest is rather lengthy, probably in the area around 30 hours or so, depending on how much side stuff you decide to do. There is so many people to talk to, things to find and places to explore, that you can just take your time wandering around and literally lose yourself in the world that builds up remarkably well thanks to the supporting cast. Now when it comes to the visual makeup of the game, it was incredible for an RPG of its time. It's colourful but at the same time incorporates a gritty, shady atmosphere that hints at an ever-looming evil. There are little touches like passing clouds overhead and limited reflection effects in certain areas that really help to bring everything together. If you're fond of its more popular sequels, going back and seeing where it all began is worthwhile, even to this day. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 2 as that will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos that release every Monday and Thursday. You can follow me on all of the socials which are linked below to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skill Jim, Shuden, Richard, Daniel, Dio, Omar, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, Maximus, Scott, Alfred, Terry, Ryan, Alex, GameCube Galaxy, Curse Salaryman, Fake, and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.